He keeps saying your name. I sat with that sentence longer than I sat with almost anything else that morning, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, half expecting something ugly, half expecting nothing at all. 7 years is a long time to build a wall. Long enough that I'd stopped flinching every time a car that looked like my father's pulled up somewhere near me. Long enough that I'd stopped rehearsing arguments with my mother in the shower, stopped drafting furious unsent texts to Renata at 2 in the morning, stopped waking up with my jaw clenched from dreams where I was still 17 and still the one who got blamed for everything. I'd built an actual life on the other side of that wall, a job I liked, apartment with plants that had somehow survived my care, a therapist named Dana who'd helped me understand, slowly, painfully, that my family's version of me had never been an accurate one. And now here was my mother's cracked voice, and Renata's flattened one, telling me that on the other side of that wall, my father was possibly dying and asking for the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 7 years. I made more tea I didn't drink and kept listening. Voicemail 10 was my mother again, this time trying, and failing, to sound composed, reading off details like she was reciting them from a whiteboard someone had handed her in a hospital corridor. The name of the surgeon, the word dissection, a phrase about watching for the next 12 hours that she said twice, like repeating it might change what it meant. Voicemail 11 was silence for almost the full length of the message, just breathing, just the ambient hum of what I now recognized as an ICU waiting room, a page over an intercom, a chair scraping, someone's shoes on linoleum, before she finally said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask you this. I know that. But I'm asking anyway," and hung up before finishing the thought. Voicemail 12 was from the unfamiliar number. A woman's voice, professional, careful. "Hi, this message is for," she said my name, my full name, the way people say it when they're reading it off an intake form. "I'm calling from St. Marguerite's on behalf of the family. Your father listed you as an emergency contact and has been asking for you by name. I understand there may be some family history here, and that's not my business, but I wanted to reach out directly in case you hadn't been receiving messages through other channels." A nurse. A stranger, calling on her own initiative, cutting through whatever chaos was happening on the family side to make sure the message actually landed. Something about hearing it from someone with no stake in our particular mess made it feel more real than any of the others had. My hands were properly shaking by then. I kept going. Voicemail after voicemail from my mother, increasingly disjointed, until somewhere around message 19 there was a shift, not calmer, exactly, but more raw, like whatever performance of composure she'd been maintaining for the earlier calls had worn all the way through. "I know what I did," she said in that one, and I actually stopped the recording and played it back twice, because in 7 years I had never once heard my mother say those 5 words in that order. "I know what I did. Not I know things were hard. Not I know you felt a certain way." Just plainly, an admission, dropped into a voicemail at 1 in the morning like she couldn't hold it in any longer, or maybe like she thought if my father died, she'd never get another chance to say it, and some part of her needed it said regardless of whether I was listening. Renata's voicemails were fewer, but harder to sit through in a different way. My sister and I had never been close, not even before things fell apart. She was 5 years older, had left for college while I was still navigating our parents' particular brand of chaos alone, and had spent most of my adult life siding with our mother by default, the way people do when taking a side is easier than examining one. Her voicemails were shorter, more clipped, but underneath the clipped tone I could hear something that sounded almost like fear. "You don't have to talk to me," she said in one. "You don't have to talk to Mom if that's still where things are. But Dad's asking, and I don't know how much time there is, and I thought you'd want to know even if you don't want to come." Even if you don't want to come. Like she'd already resigned herself to the idea that I might listen to all 43 of these and still choose not to show up, and was trying, in her own inadequate way, to leave me room to make that choice without it being framed as another failure on my part. By the time I reached the last few voicemails, the messages had changed again, less urgent, more exhausted, the kind of tired that settles in after the adrenaline burns off and you're just sitting in a chair waiting for news that refuses to arrive on any schedule you can control. The 40-second voicemail was my mother again, her voice almost a whisper. "He's stable for now," she said. They said stable. I don't know what that means anymore. I just keep thinking about the last thing I said to you 7 years ago, and I keep thinking if this is it for him, I don't want it to be like that with you too. I don't want to lose both of you to the same silence. The 43rd, the last one, was just 11 seconds long, my mother's voice barely holding together. Please, whatever you decide, please just let me know you got these. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat there for what felt like a long time, staring at nothing in particular, feeling like something enormous had been dropped into the middle of a life I'd spent 7 careful years building specifically so nothing like this could reach me again. Dana, my therapist, had a phrase she used a lot. You can hold 2 true things at once. And I'd never fully understood what she meant by it until that morning, sitting there with 43 voicemails behind me and no clear sense of what came next. It was true that my parents, my mother especially, had hurt me in ways that took years of expensive therapy to even properly name, let alone heal from. It was also true that somewhere an hour and a half away, my father was lying in a hospital bed with tubes running into him, saying my name to nurses who had no idea what that name had cost me. I thought about all the reasons not to go. I thought about the version of myself who used to absorb every family crisis like it was hers to fix, who used to drop everything, cancel plans, drive through storms, all to prove she deserved a place in a family that never quite made room for her to begin with. I didn't want to be her again. I didn't know, sitting there with cold tea and a phone full of other people's fear, whether going now would be an act of genuine choice or just that old reflex, wearing a more sympathetic disguise. But I also thought about the nurse's voice, calm and unconnected to any of our history, simply relaying a fact. He has been asking for you by name. Not for an apology. Not for reconciliation on anyone's terms but his own, in whatever state a person is in when they're not sure how many more hours they have. Just my name, apparently, over and over, to whoever would listen. I picked my phone back up, opened a new message instead of dialing, and typed out a single line to my mother. Not a promise, not yet, just enough to answer the last thing she'd asked of me. I got them. I'm thinking. Then I sat there, phone in hand, trying to figure out what thinking was actually going to lead me to do. I didn't sleep after sending that message. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down in front of me, watching the screen light up periodically from the corner of my eye, my mother's replies arriving in short, careful bursts like she was afraid of scaring me off with too much at once. Thank you. Take whatever time you need. Then, 20 minutes later, he's still stable. No change. Then, almost an hour after that, something that made me put my tea down entirely. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just didn't want you finding out later that I never told you. I called Dana at 9 that morning, technically before her office hours, and she picked up anyway, the way she sometimes did when I texted that something was urgent. I told her everything, the voicemails, the nurse, the aortic dissection, my mother's 5 strange, honest words, Renata's even if you don't want to come. Dana listened the way she always did, without rushing me toward a conclusion, and when I finally ran out of things to say, she asked me one question that cut through all of it. What do you want to have done, a year from now looking back? Not what did I owe them. Not what would make me the bigger person. What did I want to have done? I sat with that for a long moment before I realized I already knew the answer, and it surprised me, not because it meant going, but because of how uncomplicated it felt once I stopped trying to make it about anyone but myself. I didn't want to go because my mother needed absolution, or because Renata needed a witness, or even because my father needed to see my face before he possibly died. I wanted to go because some part of me still loved him, uncomplicatedly, underneath 7 years of necessary distance, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life not knowing if that had mattered. I drove up that afternoon. 90 minutes that felt like 4 hours, the radio off the entire way because I couldn't hold a thought long enough to follow a song, just the flat gray highway, and every rehearsed version of what I might say when I walked into that room dissolving the second I tried to hold on to it. I hadn't seen my mother's face in 7 years except in photos other relatives occasionally, thoughtlessly, tagged me in online. I didn't know what I was walking toward, an ambush of old grievances dressed up as a family reunion, or something else, something I didn't have language for yet. What I found in that ICU waiting room was smaller and quieter than anything I'd braced for. My mother looked older than I'd let myself imagine, gray threaded fully through hair that used to be dyed dark without exception, like She'd stopped caring about appearances somewhere in the last 2 days, and possibly longer. She stood up when she saw me, hands twisting together, and didn't move toward me, like she'd learned, somewhere along the way, not to assume she still had the right to close that distance herself. "You came," she said, and her voice broke on the second word in a way that undid something in my chest I'd kept carefully locked for years. "I came for him," I said, which was true, and also, I think, a boundary I needed to state out loud before I let myself feel anything else in that room. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant and didn't argue with it. Renata was there too, sitting a few chairs down, and when she saw me she didn't get up right away, just looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between relief and shame, before she finally stood and said, quietly, "Thank you for coming," which was more restrained and more honest than anything she'd said in any of her voicemails. They let me in to see him for a few minutes, one visitor at a time, the nurse from the 12th voicemail. I recognized her voice before I even saw her name tag, walking me back with a gentleness that made me want to cry for entirely different reasons than everything else that day. My father looked smaller in that bed than I remembered him being in real life. Tubes and monitors doing quiet, mechanical work around him, his eyes closed until I was nearly at the bedside, and then, slowly, opening. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, like he needed time to confirm I was actually there and not some morphine-softened wish his mind had conjured up. Then his mouth moved, dry and slow. "You came," he said, an echo of my mother's exact words in the waiting room, and something about hearing the same sentence from both of them, independently, undid me more than either voicemail had. "I heard you were asking for me," I said, sitting carefully in the chair beside the bed, not quite touching him yet, still finding my footing in a room heavy with 7 years of silence and monitors beeping their steady, indifferent rhythm. "I wasn't sure you'd want to," he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something physical, "I wasn't sure I deserved you to." I didn't have a tidy response to that. I still don't, honestly, even now. I told him I was there, that I wasn't going anywhere for the moment, that he should focus on breathing and not on 7 years of things neither of us were going to resolve in an ICU room with a nurse checking vitals every 15 minutes. He nodded, or tried to, and closed his eyes again, though his hand found mine on the blanket and held on with more strength than I expected from someone who'd nearly died 2 nights earlier. He didn't die that night or the next. Over the following week, camped in a hospital cafeteria with my mother and sister in increments neither too long nor too short, something strange and slow began happening between the three of us. Not reconciliation, not exactly, nothing so clean as that word implies, but something adjacent to it. My mother told me things in that cafeteria she'd never said in 7 years of silence, things I suspect she'd never said out loud to anyone, about her own upbringing, about patterns she'd absorbed and repeated without meaning to, about watching me leave, and telling herself for a long time that it was my failure rather than something she'd had a hand in creating. I didn't forgive her in that cafeteria. I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of this story where everything gets resolved over hospital coffee is a comforting lie people tell to make estrangement feel temporary and reversible on a schedule that suits everyone but the person who left. It wasn't like that. It was slower, messier, full of long silences where neither of us knew what to say and said nothing rather than filling the space with something false. Renata and I talked properly for the first time in over a decade, not just as two people who happen to share parents, but as people trying, awkwardly, to understand what our childhood had actually looked like from 2 very different vantage points inside the same house. She admitted, quietly, one night in the parking garage while we were both too tired to keep performing composure, that she'd known, on some level, how unfairly I'd been treated growing up, and had let it happen because addressing it would have meant admitting her own comfortable position in the family required my discomfort to exist. It wasn't an easy thing to hear. It was, at least, honest, and honesty was more than I'd had from any of them in 7 years. My father recovered, slowly, unevenly, the kind of recovery that comes with new limitations and long lists of medications and a permanent, careful watchfulness around his own heart that none of us had needed before. I visited him in the weeks that followed, not every day, not with the old compulsive need to prove myself useful to a family that had never quite made room for me, but on my own terms, at my own pace, the way Dana had gently encouraged me to consider doing if I chose to re-engage at all. Some visits were good. Some were hard. Old patterns resurfacing in smaller, more manageable versions. My mother occasionally slipping back into the same dismissive tone I remembered from childhood before catching herself, visibly, and correcting course. Progress, I've learned, doesn't move in a straight line, especially not with people you've known your entire life. It's been 8 months now since that night the 43 voicemails arrived. I'm not fully back in my family's life the way I once was, and I don't think I ever will be. Not in the old shape of it. The one where I absorbed every crisis and every unspoken expectation without question. But I'm not fully outside it anymore either. I see my father every couple of weeks. My mother and I are, slowly, cautiously, building something that resembles an actual relationship rather than a performance of one, built on honesty this time, on her acknowledging things rather than deflecting them, on me holding boundaries I no longer feel guilty about holding. Renata and I text more than we ever used to, careful and tentative, but real. Sometimes I think about that night, sitting at my kitchen table with cold tea and a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing, and I think about how close I came to letting it all just ring out unanswered, the way I'd trained myself to do for 7 years. I don't regret the years of silence. They were necessary. They saved something in me that needed saving, and I'd make that same choice again if I were back at 30, sitting in that car outside my apartment, deciding I couldn't keep absorbing a family's dysfunction and calling it love. But I'm glad, in the end, that I listened to all 43 messages instead of deleting them unheard, glad that underneath everything, the years, the hurt, the version of myself I'd had to leave behind to survive that family, there was still enough left in me to hear my name being asked for, and choose, on my own terms this time, to answer it.